So welcome back to another episode of Professor Habben's Science Cabin. Again, today we're down on the farm here at Tug Hill Farm in Morrison, Illinois, and I'm going to answer that question on how do they dry the grain, why do they dry the grain, and kind of how that whole operation works. There's many different ways grain can be dried. You can dry it just with air, blowing a fan through it. That takes a lot longer. It's you got to be very on top of it, and if your grain is too moist or if you don't have a stirring mechanism to stir it up while you're doing that, you could have some spoilage. You could have some problems with that. There are dryers that are external to a grain bin that you run it through and it dries it quickly, and then it puts it into the grain bin for storage. That's very common, especially for your larger farmers. And then there's like what I have here, which is where I actually dry in the grain bin. And I'll explain how that works. And I do two methods of drying on my farm here. Sometimes I dry using propane and heating the grain so I can dry it quicker and get that grain out and shipped out of the bin in a matter of a handful of days, a week typically. Other times I just use air to dry the grain, and that can take months to get the grain dry that way using the air. So I'm going to talk through quite a bit of the operation before I fire things up, because a lot of this stuff is quite noisy. The fan's noisy, the burner makes noise, the stirrator makes noise, and I know you're wondering, what are all those things? Well, I will explain them here in a minute. So come with me. We're going to go over and I'm going to kind of show you the parts of this and kind of how it's done. So first off here, you can see that I got my propane tank. And on this bin here, I have a 1,000 gallon propane tank. And like many farmers, I contract that propane early in the season to get a price discount by locking in that price in the summer months and committing that I'm going to buy a certain number of gallonage. Sometimes you got to kind of guess at that. Every year's a little different. You don't know how much you're going to need for drying, but typically I do end up drying some. So in this little building here, and you notice I have a little building that covers up my fan, okay? And it has screening around the bottom of it. Well, Tug Hill Farm here, my farm site is kind of tucked back into the woods. And many years ago, a little over 20 years ago, I had a problem where I actually grenaded a fan because leaves from the trees had got sucked onto the fan screen, and I didn't notice in time. It created enough suction that the screen actually pulled through, went into the fan, and the whole fan basically exploded, came apart. Fan blades came out of the side of the fan. Luckily, I was not near it when it happened, but I was disappointed that I had to buy a new fan. Therefore, I built the building, put screening around it, and because the wind can't blow the leaves around, I get very few leaves in there. Even though I have this doorway that's open all the time, the leaves just don't naturally want to go in there much. So it works much better. I can leave it for weeks at a time and not have a leaf problem. So in here, in the little building, you will see the green item here. That's the heater, okay? The item before it back here, that is the fan. That is a 24-inch fan, okay? 2 foot apart. I think you can picture that, okay? 24-inch fan. That fan turns 3,450 RPMs. So this isn't like your house fan. This is no slow-moving fan. This baby turns, and it moves a lot of air, okay? Probably can't see much through the screen, but this is the screen that goes into it. There's a 10 horsepower motor in there that runs that fan, and it turns quite quick, and it's very loud. Same general design as like a box fan would be in your home, from like a pitch type setting, but it does use a lot of energy. That 10 horsepower motor is 10 horsepower on 230 volts. Real close calculation on that to put it in reality for you kids at home or you parents at home. When this fan is running, the fan alone, I'm not talking about the burner, just the fan, it will put out the same amount of electricity or demand the same amount of electricity as 100 watt light bulbs. So your standard incandescent light bulb that we all grew up with for many years, 100 of the largest size that you typically would put in your home. A lot of your lamps or your end tables and stuff are like 60 watters and things like that. Well, might be 150 of those, okay? So just think of that. When I turn this fan on, it's the same thing as turning on 100 large 100 watt light bulbs, okay? Mathematically, what's that mean to my electric bill? Well, yeah, it kind of dings you, but it's the cost of farming. You have to dry the grain. It's an expense. It's just like any other expense, the work you have to do, the equipment you have to do. But in general, depending what the electric rate is, this fan will cost me about $350 a month to run if I run it continuous for the entire month. I don't typically run it year round that way, but when I do dry my grain using air, which I always do with the last bin full of grain, is I always dry it with air with no heat from the propane. I will usually end up running that fan total through the winter months until April when I usually sell my grain. I will run it anywhere from 2 to 3 months of total running time, depending how wet the grain was. The grain that I put in here this year is 22%. It'll take me that much running. I will probably run it continuous most of the last half of October here, most of November. Depending how cold we get in December, I'll start cycling it some, because once I get the grain cold, once I freeze the grain, I don't need to blow the fan as much. And then I will run the fan sporadically, maybe a few days at a time, every couple weeks through the winter. And then I will run it continuously for a couple weeks in March when we warm it back up, and that'll do the final drying. And it should come out of there in pretty good condition, between 14-15% moisture when spring comes in April. Okay, so the burner. Burner's also 24 inches in diameter, just so it lines up with the fan. It's variable BTU. I can adjust the gas pressure to really adjust how much heat and flame I want to put out. Substantially larger than your home furnace, okay? Just leave it at that. When I have the gas on, the burner on it is about this big around. It's got multiple, like about 3/8 inch holes in it. And the flame that comes out of there is about 18 inches to 2 foot long. So we are talking a long, big, round ball of fire coming out of there that's blowing underneath of this grain bin, with this fan blowing the air through that fire, okay, and carrying that heat up into the bin, okay? To give you an idea, my first batch of grain that I ran in the bin here this year, it had 5 semi-loads, so about 5,000 bushel I had in there, okay? It went in at about 22% moisture, came out somewhat dry at about 15.5 is where I sold it. This big propane tank that I have right here was full when it started, and when I checked it when I was done. It took me about 5 days to dry it, and I went through a little over 600 gallons of propane. Put that in reality, the large farmhouse that's here on this farm, that's about how much propane it took to heat that entire farmhouse all winter last year. I went through it in 5 days here, just drying 5 semi-loads of grain, okay? Mathematically, with today's prices, basically you could say it cost me about $220 per semi-load to dry that grain. Something you don't want to do if you can avoid it, but many farmers have to. It really depends on the season, how wet the corn is when we take it out of the field. But when you see these farmers running their grain dryers, that is a substantial expense to them. It's a necessary thing. Grain will not store if you don't get it dry enough. You can't keep it. As you well know, people and animals need food year round. They're not going to eat all this corn in the first month when we harvest it. So we have to get it in good condition so we can store it. So with that, you understand what the fan is. You understand what the burner is. The burner has a thermostat on it, so it has a temp sensor underneath the grain in the bin. The bottom of this bin, as you can see, there's kind of rings to this bin, okay? From there to the next row of bolts here, okay? That's a ring, okay? The bottom ring of the bin, way down at the bottom, and I've got a gate here in the way, so it makes it a little hard to see. But there's a floor that's halfway up on that ring, okay? So we've got about 12, 13 inches underneath of that floor of open space. And that floor has, it's kind of like screening, okay? It's vented, okay? So that the air can flow up through the grain from there. So the heater and the air blow into that large cavern underneath there, and then that way the air can go up through the bin evenly. Well, underneath in that area, there's a temperature sensor. And right down here, a little hard to see, get it down here a little closer, but going through the wall there is that temp sensor, okay? And then it comes in and it ties into a thermostat here. Very much like your home, I have a knob on that thermostat that I can say I want the temperature of the air under that floor to be 60 degrees, 120 degrees, 140 degrees. Those are common drying temperatures. 120, 140, that's pretty high. I don't typically dry in that area unless I'm in a rush or if it's very warm weather. If we're in 80-degree weather, that's okay. A lot of what the drying is done is through what we call temperature rise. You take what today's temperature is, and when you increase that temperature, that makes that air drier, and then that's going to help dry your grain, okay? A humid morning, grain's not going to dry with that air going through. But if you raise it up 40 degrees, the dew point of that is still down at that cooler temperature, and therefore it's pretty dry air at that temperature, and it will dry your grain. Typical thing I'll a lot of times run is about 40 degrees of temperature rise. So I'll set my thermostat a lot of times based on what the normal temperature is of a given afternoon in that time period and let it run there. Monitor it daily, see how the grain's drying, and we get our grain dried down in typically less than a week, and I can get it shipped out and go on to the next binful. Sometimes, depending on the year, I have several binfuls of grain. This year I had just 2. Depends how many acres you farm and what the yields are, etc. This bin will actually hold about 7,000 bushel when it's full, and that's what's in it today. Okay, I'm gonna start the fan up. I already have the burner set to go, okay? So when I start the fan, I'm gonna get away from it quickly because, as I already told you, I had one grenade at one time, so I don't take chances. I start it and I get away from it because probably one of the riskiest times, if it's out of balance or something, is right at startup. Once it's up and running smooth, probably gonna run okay. So I'm gonna start it, get away from it, and then we're gonna listen. There's a time delay on the burner starting. I can't remember if it's 30 seconds or a minute. I always just stand here till it goes, so I never really timed it. But that's so that it makes sure if the gas was leaking under the grain bin, that it blew enough air through there first that we don't have like an explosion, okay? It's a safety measure. Again, you always got to think safety on the farm. The other thing you can see is there's a light bulb right there, kind of by the bill of my hat. That's a feature I added here at the farm that's for my own purposes. It's not part of the normal system, but every time that burner goes, that light bulb comes on. And with that thermostat, as you already figured out, that burner is going to kick on, just like your home furnace, and kick off and kick on to try to maintain that temperature that I have it set at. So it will kick on and off, and I have a camera system on the farm for security purposes. I can see that light bulb on that camera. So when I'm at home and not here at the farm, I can see if the burner is working properly. Kind of a handy little tool. Okay, when I start the fan, it's gonna get very loud. Apologize for that. That's just kind of how this goes on the farm sometimes. All right, so you can hear the fan blowing there. Like I said, I just kicked on basically 100 watt light bulbs there. So the old power meter started spinning here on the farm a little quicker than it was a little bit ago. And then as we listen, we'll hear that burner kick in and that light bulb come on. There, see the lights on? Burner's going. So it's putting that heat under that floor and pushing that up through the grain. When it reaches the temperature, that light bulb's gonna go off, okay? There it went off, so it reached the temperature. I can't remember what I got set at, doesn't really matter. Because I'm not actually heating drying this bin full of grain, I'm gonna go turn the heater back off, and then we're gonna go show how we stir the grain during the drying process, okay? So hang with me, here we go. So I turn the burner back off, so I only had that on to demonstrate to you how that worked, okay? Now, I apologize, but I'm gonna have to put you in my pocket for a little bit because I have to climb up the bin ladder. Yep, see that ladder there on the bin? About 25 feet up to the top of it. Got to use all my hands and feet for climbing that safely. So you're gonna get to go for a ride with me in my pocket. We get to the top, I will show you the stirration system that we have, okay? So let me get that started here. Okay, so I just turned on the stirrator. And so when I'm drying the grain, I usually leave that stirrator run. Now when I'm just air drying, which is much slower, I will usually run it for like a full day once a week, just to make sure that grain's getting mixed up. When I'm drying with heat, it's running the whole time, okay? That's so that the grain at the bottom that might be drier gets mixed with the grain at the top, and you also don't end up with areas that maybe the air can't flow through as good, that end up haunting you and becoming a core of bad grain. That can happen with a bin that you're not able to stir up, okay? So stirrator is a really good device for my purposes here on my farm. All right, we're gonna climb up and show you how that works. Hang on. So again, gotta think safety here with making sure we're hanging on, which is why you're hanging on in my pocket and not hanging on in my hand. 3 points of contact when you climb ladders, kids. Remember that, 3 points of contact. All right, I'm getting up here on the roof. All right, made it up here on the roof. We're up on top of the grain bin, okay? You can see up above the farm. Okay, now, if you look down in here, You can see the grain is just a little bit down here because the ben's as full as it can be and still run the stirrator. If you're listening close, you'll hear that stirrator touching the grain in there, flinging it around. So what's the stirrator? Let me explain that a little bit. The stirrator is 3 screws, augers, okay? But they don't have a tube around them. They're like an open auger. And they go the entire length of the bend. So this bend is about 25 feet to the ceiling. It has that false floor underneath of it, you know, so that the air can get in there. So these screws are 22 feet long, okay? 22 feet long, go to the bottom of the grain, and carry the grain up from the bottom of the bend to the top of the bend. The grain from the top of the bend flows back down kind of behind the screws, and it constantly stirs. The screws go round and round in the bend, and they also move back and forth on this bar that they're on. I'm explaining most of this ahead of time because it's a little noisy in there. I'll kind of do it again, but wanted to make sure that you could hear me clearly. So into the bend we go. I'm just gonna hang on to you because I'm only honestly stepping down 2 steps. It's really not a big deal. See, I'm actually standing on the grain now. My head's not even in the lid yet. Okay, we're in the grain bend. And over here behind me is the stirrator. Okay? So as I explained to you a little bit ago, it's those little augers, okay? They're carrying the grain up from the bottom of the bend. So those kernels you're seeing coming up there are coming all the way from the bottom of the bend, coming up here to the top, okay? There's 3 screws on there. There's one by the outside wall that stays by the outside wall all the time. There's 2 that move back and forth on this tube here, okay? They move back and forth on that tube. That way they can stir all the grain. We don't miss any of the grain. We wouldn't want to not stir the middle of the bend or something like that. We're trying to stir all the grain. Look on the other side of the bend, you can kind of see some ridges here, okay? That's where the stirrator kind of left its piles where it went before. You look over on this side, and you can see how the grain's coming up. But then you can also see this pocket back here. That's where the grain is going back down, okay? Those screws, because they're dragging through the grain, they're kind of angling, okay? So the bottom of that screw is a few feet back from where the top of it is. That's why you see that grain sinking back here a little bit behind the screw, because that's actually the area that the bottom of the screw is pulling the grain away from. So that's how we mix up the grain. And very important to do when you're drying in a grain bend, like I do, okay? You can dry with air without it. A little bit safer as far as making sure that you get the grain all dry doing it this way. Now, how does that thing go around and around the bend? Right here at the end of it, there's a little motor here. There's little switches on those screws. So when they get tilted far enough, it stops that motor. When they work their way straight enough, it'll let that motor go. It'll walk ahead around the bend a little bit. And this wheel will turn, okay? See, it's turning there right now, okay? And it turns just a little bit each time. And then it'll wait until the screws catch up and it'll turn again, okay? Typically, it will take a few hours for the stirrator to go all the way around the bend one time, okay? So with that, I hope you learned something today. Hope you learned about how we dry the grain, how we make sure that we have the grain in good condition. It's really important to do that we make sure that we get it dry so it'll store till the next year and we don't lose our grain. Just to give a little perspective, a grain bin full of grain like this, 7,000 bushel at today's prices, and prices are high right now, okay? Just like grocery store everywhere else. You guys know that, okay? At today's prices, there's about $50,000 worth of grain in this bin right now, okay? So as a farmer, I have to take very good care of that. That's a lot of money, and that's more than the profit is on my farm. So if I lost that grain, it would not be a good situation. So why do I do only the air on the last bin full of grain, okay? We can maybe cover this some other time in a different show or topic of just general science type stuff. But as you well know, because you're all smart, I know that, okay? As you well know, like, things condense on things that are cold, okay? It's kind of like the dew getting on your car in the morning, things like that, okay? Well, if I am drying with heat in this bin, especially at this time of year, here it is, it's 30th October today. So it's kind of cooler out. It's, 40-degree mornings, 30-degree mornings, things like that. The outside wall of this grain bin will get cold because it's touching the outside of the world. That warm, moist air inside the bin is going to condense out against that outside wall. Literally condense, kind of like the dew on your car in the morning or the dew on the grass, and make that outside wall wet. Literally wet. So the kernels that are against that outside wall, for one, will stick to the wall and not stir with the stirrator like I want them to stir. And two, because they stick to the wall, they will stay there and stay wet, and they will actually rot. I will end up, if I dry with heat in my last bin full of grain in temperatures like this, like if I was doing it in the summer, it wouldn't be a problem. But where I'm gonna have that condensation problem, I would end up with an inch or two of rotten grain around the outside of this bin, the whole height of the bin. And that's not good to deal with, okay? Am I gonna say I've never had that happen a little bit before? I have. That's how I learned that. I learned that about 30 years ago, not to dry that last bin full of corn. Since then, don't have a problem. But it's still important to cycle your fan and run it often enough through the winter, because you still have that same problem. If this grain in this bin is 50 degrees and it gets 10 below zero outside, what moisture is in that grain is gonna try to migrate to where that cold area is, and I could still get moisture there. So even when it's 10 below zero, there's times I run this bin fan to try to get the bin to the same temperature. The other thing that's kind of interesting is when you turn that fan on, you need to run it for several hours at a minimum. You can't turn it on for just an hour and stop, because it will be pushing a layer of temperature change up through that bin, and you could leave layers of moisture in that bin if you do short cycles like that. So you have to run it long enough. Well, I know this was one of the more longer episodes I've done, a little bit more in depth. I apologize for that, but at the same time, I really hope you learned something out of this. And again, thank you for tuning in to Professor Habben's Science Cabin. I hope you learned something about grain drying. I hope maybe this is something that'll help you think about those farmers in the future. And above all, try to be safe in everything you do. Goodbye.